So what this does is Brian in 1896 runs, the Tigers do quite well. They don't win the election, but they win most of the southern and western states based on this idea of cheap money, based on this idea of fair farmers. In the long term, what it does is it really destroys any real alternative to capital. The populace at that moment actually had presented what I think is the only, there are two significant challenges to capitalism, to the capitalist system in the United States. All right? You want to take a guess on what that first one was? Quick trick question. It occurs in 1861. Two legitimate and serious challenges to American capitalism, to the U.S. capitalist system. One occurs in 1861. What part of that? What? The Confederacy. The Confederacy is not a capitalist system, right? It's a slave labor system. They reject slavery. They reject essentially a capitalist system. So the Confederacy and then the populism, right? The populists weren't just trying to help the Democratic Party in the revolutionaries like Obama's associates, so right? Most of these groups are, you know, they just want to tweak things together. They want to put a gild on it. They want to clean it up a little bit. The populists actually challenged the basic foundational tenets of capitalism, private ownership and government control and things like that. So what you had then was, with regard to that, you know, this challenge that the government should keep up the railroads, that the government should create banks, that the government should make silver, that the government should have an income tax. A lot of the stuff the populists suggested actually came to pass. For instance, women voting. The first states to do the women voting in the United States tend to be populous states, states that have populous governors and populous representatives. So even before the federal amendment in 1920 that gave women the vote, there were a few states where the populace had big, the populace were big advocates of public education. So the first states that had like a series of public educational programs where the state created systems, gave books, you know, created schools not just for the wealthy but for others. This much education was private. And really until World War II, better education was private. Not that many people went to college, and if you were poor, your chances of going to college almost insignificant. The idea after World War II that democratized education. So the populists really were really kind of, by far, I think, the most successful challenge to capitalism in U.S. history. Not just trying to tweak it, but actually trying to come to a point. But at the end, what happens to them? They get crushed. I mean, they're co-opted by the Democrats, and based on this idea of racial politics as well. Right? So, audio device was disconnected or reconfigured. Right. Right. So by 1898, again by 1900, what you have then is clearly again another attempt to challenge the status quo, and we generally talk about this as being based on class. Were the populist a class-based movement in the sense, obviously, if you want to look at that in terms of being like an industrial proletariat, no, they weren't. All right, but if you want to look at it in terms of being this group, which was outside the levers of power, which did have access to private capital, then sure. I mean, I don't think we need to be that, you know, kind of Catholic and dogmatic about it all, that we're going to say they're capitalist or not. I mean, it's clearly a class-based system. It's definitely a class-based system that challenges that and is crushed. And with that, by 1900, I think it's clear then that the system that's been in place, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War, is going to last. I mean, it's there. They're good to go. And they're going to be around for a while, right? It still says mute, though. The red X is still up there on the mute button. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I played with that. So, I mean, this is the first time this has ever happened. You know, before Christmas when we were in here, there was no problem. This isn't the only case of that. There's another one. It's not very well known, but I like talking about it. It's actually one of my favorites. And this is a combination of an agrarian movement and a World War I protest. All right? And it starts in Oklahoma, of all places. Especially Oklahoma is probably the most conservative state in the country right now. But Oklahoma has a really long radical tradition. And one of my favorite Oklahoma radical groups are the Green Corn Rebels. Right? In 1917, what you had in Oklahoma was the Green Corn Rebellion. Anybody ever heard of that? Of course not. Most historians have never heard of Green Corn Rebellion, but it's actually a lot of fun. There's two elements to this. One is that farmers were still being pretty badly screwed over. They were deeply in debt. Government policies and bank policies obviously favored industry, manufacturers. A lot of these southern farmers, these rural farmers, were losing their lands to foreclosure. In the early 19 teens, over 60% of mortgaged farms in Oklahoma were lost to debt. So 60% of farms went under in just like the early World War I years, 1914 to 1917. A lot of these people were old, they were in debt. They referred to themselves as serfs or peons, and they referred to theirs as a feudal system. Within that, a bunch of kind of radical alternatives opposed, including the socialists. And in Oklahoma, in 1914, the Socialist Party got 16% of the vote, and in 1914, a socialist candidate in Oklahoma got 21% of the vote. Think of that. A socialist candidate in the United States getting 20% of the vote. In 1912, Eugene Debs got 1 million votes for president. Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate, gets 1 million votes. That year, there were four. It was a weird election. There was Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Debs. And all four of them claimed that they were progressives, right? Now, Debs finished last, but he got 1 million votes. The Green Corn Rebellion, then, these people who led this movement belonged to something called the Working Class Union. So there is, in the South, in Oklahoma, a group that calls itself the Working Class Union, which is really quite telling by itself. It said that any members of the working class who were over the age of 18, regardless of race, sex, color, or occupation, could join, and that any means necessary would be used to any means necessary would be used to get kind of class justice. The Working Class Union claimed that it had over 30,000 members in 1917. Think of this. Now, in addition to these rural politics and these foreclosures and land problems, they were also anti-war, in much the same way that Eugene Debs was anti-war. Why should we go fight this war for all these rich capitalists when we're not getting anything out of it, right? So they decide what they were going to do is they were going to take their grievances straight to the seat, straight to the heart of power. They were going to go talk to Woodrow Wilson. They referred to Woodrow Wilson as Big Slick. That was his nickname, not a nice one. Big Slick, like he was this oily, slimy guy. I guess they would probably say the same about Gingrich today or something like that, right? And they load up. So what they do is they load up all their carts with green corn. I'm no farmer, but apparently green corn will ripen on the way and they can eat it until they get to Washington. I don't know. I guess I buy green bananas and they ripen, so maybe it's the same principle. But the Green Corn Rebels took off. They were going to go to Washington, and they were going to tell Big Slick what they thought of him, the kind of powers that be in the community put together a little militia, a posse of 70 armed men. They headed for the rebels' encampment, and when they saw the armed posse, they essentially dispersed. So the Green Corn Rebellion didn't really do much, but there was a brutal backlash. 450 men were arrested for participating, considering they didn't really do anything. Hey, I don't think it's a computer problem. I think it's a thing problem here. Did you see the mute sign up there? The red X is still on it. Mm-hmm.
It was a time of great and exalting excitement. The country was up in arms, the
No, it's
war
good to go
was
now.
on,
I shouldn't have a problem.
and every breast burned the holy fire of
thanks.
patriotism. The drums were beating, the bands playing, the toy pistols popping, the bunch.
Maybe you looked at it. I don't know. Looked at it. 450 Green Corn rebels were arrested, but what did they do? They had made plans to march on Washington. 184 were indicted, 150 were convicted. A lot of socialists who were just there were also arrested. Posses hunted down hundreds of other suspected insurgents. It turned violent. I mean, this is like a big deal, and no one's ever heard of it, right? They fought several engagements. It turns very ugly. A bunch of these people were convicted and served in Leavenworth, in Kansas. There were sedition, probably sedition, insurrection, conspiracy. This is in the after World War I. You have the Sedition Act, which makes it a crime to essentially challenge, question the U.S. government. There are all these attacks on civil liberties. The Green Corn rebels, the land system stayed the same. Interest rates and tax rates could rise to be in the 60% range. The working class union kind of fizzled out, not surprisingly. 175 men received sentences ranging from 30 days in jail to 10 years at Leavenworth prison, many of whom had no part in the rebellion. Okay? So this is what happens. This is one of those kind of radical movements that you never hear about, but really, kind of is really quite important. And this kind of, I won't say it certainly doesn't close out the period of agricultural radicalism, but it's very hard. And again, I think you see the same outcome, right? At the end of the day, what's the consequence of these actions? What's the consequence of these actions? What happened at Haymarket? What happened at Pullman? What happened at Homestead? What happened at the end of all of this? Who succeeded? Who did? Who won? The states, right? And the same thing happens, right, with the populists and with the Green Corn. Now, the populists, you don't necessarily have state repression. You have what's called co-optation. You know what co-optation is? Because that's a real different. Again, if you follow the Occupy movement, one of the real fears right now isn't that they're going to be crushed, although that could happen, but it's that they're going to be co-opted, right? Nobody knows what being co-opted means. Taken over by another group, right? Now, in this case, the fear is being taken over by what kind of group? Taken over by a more radical group? No, by less so. So, for the populists, who co-opted the populists? The Democrats did. Were the Democrats as radical as the populists? Not at all. The Democrats weren't calling for government control of the railroads or new banks or anything like that. The Democrats essentially wanted the government to make it easier for farmers to get loans and also to keep blacks in their place, right? So there was this fear of co-optation. In the case of the Green Corn rebels, it was actually outright government repression. And that's one of the reasons I like talking about that, because it's not that well known. And when you think about it, it's pretty insignificant, right? These farmers in Oklahoma who were gonna get on their wagons full of green corn and go to Washington, D.C. to thumb their noses at Woodrow Wilson. This isn't exactly the Bolshevik army. And yet, what did they do? What was the repression? It was harsh, really harsh. So the government takes seriously the challenges them, right? So you have then this populist radicalism as well. So by the beginning of the 20th century, you see there's significant legacy in the United States of these class-based politics, these radical class-based politics. And it's something that, whereas in other countries people are quite familiar with it, in the U.S., and history is very political. History is very political. Why is it that we know so little of most of this stuff that I've talked about? Maybe I'm wrong, but it's my assumption that we know the stuff I'm telling you about so far. For the most part, most of you haven't heard about this. Is that a fair assumption? Well, the victors write history, but it's more than that. I mean, there's more than the victors write history. What's the purpose of it? I mean, yeah, victors write history to make themselves look good, but why not talk about these things? Because in fact, they could write this. Well, they're victors. Well, we crushed those Bolsheviks in the Green Corn Rebellion. They don't even do that. It's like I mentioned the other day, here in Texas, the Camp Logan riots. Who knows about that, right? Why? Why don't we know about this stuff I've been talking about? But, well, yeah, but what else? What's that? Well, yeah, I think that's. Well, yeah, I mean, I think you don't want people to have a sense that this stuff has happened and that they could do it too. You know, there's I think a real sense that you would rather have everybody think that things have always kind of like nothing to see here, move on, right? You know, just the small troublemakers, that's all. And we tend to look at it that way. And if you knew that there was this sustained, well over a century already, history of struggle based on these economic issues or class issues or agrarian issues, then I think people would more likely see that. And the flip side of that on the left, because I read a lot of stuff now where people try to invoke this, is people on the left don't get it either. I mean, there's a bad history there where people like romanticize things. Oh, look what they did. Well, in fact, they got crushed, you know, which is why, like, when Scott, Parker and Amy Price were here, I mean, I would give a far more, and I will give a far more kind of negative appraisal of this, what it means than they would. I mean, a lot of people kind of say, oh, look at what they did. We stopped the Vietnam War, and we can do this and that. You're not going to do that here, right? So that's kind of what's happening. World War I brings on a whole new level of radicalism and repression. Now, we talked a little bit about that with regard to Debs, but one of the reasons I had you I told you ahead of time to watch Reds was because of this. I could talk about this, but it would be at some length. It's a fairly complex thing. Like I said, I don't like teaching via Hollywood, but sometimes there's some good stuff out there. And there are some movies which are every bit as good as documentaries, and Reds actually is one of them. It's an outstanding movie. It set aside all the puppy dogs and Christmas tree stuff. The politics of it are great. Warren Beatty did his homework. I don't know if you noticed the people he had speaking in between. They were called the witnesses. Anybody know who some of those folks were? These were people who actually were there. These were actual participants in the politics of World War I, both pro and con, right? So it really was well done. What did you get out of that? What did that film tell you about this era? So there was this kind of legitimate interest in alternative solutions to these problems, right? What did it tell you about World War I? It wasn't necessarily the most popular war. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran for president, right? Does anybody know what his campaign slogan was up there? He kept us out of war, no war. Promised that, right? You can always tell, like, 1916, Wilson did it. In 1940, FDR said, I'm not going to the mothers of America, I will not be sending your boys into foreign wars. In 1964, LBJ says, I want you mamas American to know I ain't going to send your boys fighting to do what Asian boys ought to be doing, right? And of course, as soon as the election's over, they send people off to war, right? I mean, given the way we're going, Obama will probably bring 3 or 4 more countries if he's reelected next year, right? So Roosevelt, really kind of lets these people down. What do you have, like the main characters, people like John Reed, Emma Goldman? What's that all about? I mean, did you know that people like that existed? I mean, those aren't the kind of folks you normally see, kind of presented in American films, are they? So what did you, when you saw those folks, what did you think? Were you aware that there were those kinds of challenges? Bill Hay was the head of the Wall Street. Emma Goldman, well-known anarchist. Max Eastman, who was the editor of a really well-known magazine called The Masses. Louise Bryant, the Diane Keaton character, very well-known radical. I mean, that scene where she testified before Congress, that was real. She did that. John Reed, he was on everybody's most wanted list. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what the specific committee was, but no, there were all kinds of It was before HUAC, but it wasn't hard to bring people before Congress. I mean, no, all that stuff is real. So why, what's that tell you about this kind of? What did you see? Okay, there was actually a violent element in that era. There were, and I mentioned anarchists here. There were American anarchists, and I hate to talk about American anarchists because basically American anarchists don't know who they are. And it's difficult to talk about without sounding really derisive and nasty about them. It's actually there's a significant tradition. But being an anarchist doesn't necessarily mean you throw bombs. There were plenty of bomb throwers. There were many hundreds, actually, of acts of violence committed by so-called anarchists or other groups like that during World War I. They would blow up political buildings, corporate headquarters, things like that. It didn't occur regularly, but it wasn't that unusual either. Right? But these folks in the movie, what were they doing? Were they doing that? What were they doing? What's that? Most of them were writing. Most of them were propagandists, right? They were challenging the war. I mean, John Reed could do it. That great scene kind of toward the beginning where he's speaking at the Liberal Club with all the guys, those fat guys in their harumphing in their suits and all that kind of stuff. Reed, and what does Reed say when they said, Jack Reed, what was World War I all about? What does he say? Profits, right? So again, you don't really hear that much, right? You don't have that kind of critique yet. And so it's fairly surprising when you see somebody in 1914 saying that. There was also a radical economist named Scott Nearing, and he ended up on all the most wanted lists too, who was writing that kind of stuff. So, what else? I mean, what other kind of things, in connection to the kind of stuff we've talked about, did that film show? I mean, historically. Like how so? Well, I mean, that's what the masses was. I mean, you didn't get them. What's that? In the World War I era? Well, yeah, I mean, there in the 1800s there was a magazine called The Appeal to Reason, which was published out of Kansas, and it was actually an agrarian radical magazine, and it ended up with nearly, I think, like 1 million subscribers, really, and the government and the post office cracked down on it. I mean, in some places they just they refused to ship it, refused to deliver it, and that kind of thing, right? What? No, but the government. I mean, you ever heard of Pentagon Papers? The government. They lost, but the government. I mean, the government. Yeah, will do that. It's well nowadays with Twitter, but look what they're doing on Assange and WikiLeaks. I mean, that's heavy duty stuff, man. Bradley Manning, what they're doing to that guy, with Assange. I mean, that's the thing that Obama signed, the NDAA, where they could just go in and detain you, that kind of thing. So. What? Yeah, no, you're wrong. I mean, there's no doubt with Twitter and internet and Facebook and all that. Yeah, it's a lot easier to get this stuff out. But there was a significant, kind of body of information, a communications network that was, available at the time. Right? What else? I mean, just the whole kind of one thing that's important, and that's another reason I like this movie, is that the Bolshevik Revolution changes things dramatically on a global level. Okay? What does that do? And I think the film kind of gives you a pretty good sense of that. The Bolshevik Revolution changes the nature of radicalism forever in the 20th century. Why? Well, it succeeded in what, right, prior to this time, you have the populists and the Greenpoint rebels, even the Wobblies, right? Actually, that's why I opened this. There's a funny, let me see if I can find this. I forgot to show this the day I talked about the Wobblies, but it's kind of timeless. It's always worth having. Here we go. Even the Wobblies, Even the Wobblies, even though they challenged the system, did it within the American framework, where you had the Knights of Labor groups like that, right? This is funny, the Wobblies, I forgot I always like this. Has anybody ever seen this before? Anybody been in my class? This is the Industrial Workers of the World. They created this. This was one of their most popular posters. They actually sold quite a few of these. It was a class pyramid. This is the way capitalism works. So who's on top? Who's on top? The money, capital, right? Capital. Now remember, capital is money used for reproductive purposes. It's money used to build stuff, create more stuff, create profits, create production, right? Below that it says, we rule you. And who's that? Kings and presidents and people like that. They're in charge. Kings, presidents, kind of money bags guys, right? This is kind of a fat cat. This is a king. This is probably a prime minister, right? We rule you. We're in charge, but who do we really work for? We work for capital. We fool you. Who's this? The ministry, the church. Now, what does he mean by that? That's God wants you to, again, this is a scene, there's a movie about the coal mining wars. Remember that song I played last week, You'll Get Pie in the Sky when you do the long-haired preacher? There's a great movie John Sayles did, and I think, is this it? Let's see, it starts out with this. That young kid is actually a minister who's working for the unions. But that's that kind of whole we fool you thing. That's a great movie, Nate won. I couldn't find it, or I would put it up there. And parts of it are on YouTube, but I don't know if it has the whole thing out there. But the minister there is the director, John Sayles, he's brilliant. But we fool you. That's the whole point. We're there to tell you get pie in the sky when you don't form a union. The devil wants you to be a union man. The devil wants you to be a Bolshevik. But you need to be loyal, you need to be faithful. And that's their message to the people below them, right? Now, if that doesn't work, if people do get a little ornery, what do you have next? We shoot at you. Who's that? The armies, the militias, the cops. What class do these people come from? They're working class people. They're me and you. They're in the 99%. Again, who are they working for? They're working for the 1%. Why are they doing that? We're on the same boat. We got the same stuff. We don't make enough money. We don't have access to wealth and privilege. And yet you're doing their job, right? Just like the ministers. They'll fool you. They'll shoot at you, right? Then this big group of people, what do they say? We eat for you. And who are they? They're the fat cats, the plutocrats. They're the celebrities, That's like Lindsay Lohan and Puff Daddy and all those guys, the Rat Pack, all those guys. They're on that group. We're going to live large. We're going to live it up. We're going to live good, right? We earned it, right? Remember when Napster came along and Lars Ulrich and Dr. Dre said, they're taking money out of my kids' mouths, food out of my kids' mouths, right? But then at the very bottom, we work for all and we feed all. Who's that? Workers and farmers. Now, what do they have to do? They have to hold up this whole pyramid. with all these fat rich people on it. Okay? So that's the message that the Wobblies are trying to send. Okay? And this is considered, obviously very daring. And in Reds, one of the characters is Big Bill Haywood, who's the head of the Wobblies, all right? So what that movie is doing is showing you what radical politics were like. And what you have is, up to that time, the kind of largest kind of socialist movement, largest alternative movement. It's different than the populists, right? Populists were a political party. I mean, the socialists kind of were. And remember, what's one of the debates in there about the upcoming election? And these radicals are discussing that. What are they? And that's a debate throughout radical history in the United States. What's one of their key themes? What's one of the big debates they're having? There's an election coming up. What are these radicals trying to figure out what to do? What's the question? Should they support Wilson? Should they participate? All right? By nature, should radicals participate in the electoral system? I mean, there's not a definitive answer to that. My point is, there's a debate there, right? And so, what are they saying? Some people are saying yes. Some people are saying no. What does Jack Reed end up saying? In the beginning, he says, "Yeah, sure, I know Wilson's going to be in the war, blah blah blah," right? So there's this constant debate. Now, as soon as you do decide to join electoral forces with one of the established parties, that opens you up to the likelihood of what? The word I used a few minutes ago. Cooptation, right? Can you remain this radical group outside the mainstream, challenging the very nature of these decisions, the very nature of the American capitalist political economy, and participate in it at the same time? Can you smooth out the rough edges or change things from within? Or do you have to be on the outside throwing, metaphorically, or maybe literally, bombs? And that's one of the questions these folks go after, right? And what do they decide? What happens? They get crushed, right? There was a character who was actually very involved in the Greenwich, and this occurs at Greenwich Village. This also says a lot about cultural politics too, right? And it's something we're going to talk more about again when we get to the 60s, right? You have culture and politics. This is almost sure to go down as soon as I sit on it, so you can laugh already. But, yep. I actually thought this would break out into the cultural politics. What's going on there too? These are people in Greenwich Village. They're called Bohemians, right? You ever hear that word Bohemians? What's a Bohemian? What would you call a Bohemian today? Yeah, artsy, hippie, hipster, whatever kind of thing, right? So these are Bohemians. Not only are they politically different, but they're culturally different. What kinds of things are they doing? Free love. Well, as we said, there ain't no such thing as free love. You can pay for it one way or the other. Who are some of the characters in there? Who are some of the characters that surprised you? I know, first person who surprised me, character was Nicholson, Gene O'Neill. I didn't know Gene O'Neill hung out with those people, right? Was Gene O'Neill political? No, he's writing plays, right? It was countercultural. Louise Bryant performs in plays. These people, they're singing, they're dancing. What did that stand out to you? What struck you about that? What? Well, yeah, some of them have money. There's that whole question of trust fund radicalism, but the real question is, in our kind of narrative of radicals, aren't we supposed to see them as kind of drab and dour and angry people? They're very serious. They don't have fun. And yet, what do you see among these radicals? They're partying. They're, no, I mean, but when Louise Bryant meets and falls in love with Reed, what's her marital status? She's married to somebody else, right? Henry Miller is interviewed, right? So there's a countercultural element to this as well. Not only, and that's why it's easy, and I'll rant and rave a lot about this when we start talking about the 60s. It's easy to dismiss people. Oh, they're stupid hippies. They just want to smoke drugs and get laid and all that kind of stuff. This stuff is political, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, they challenged the war, they challenged the American system, but the fact that they lived the way they did, what else? What was the message there? What were they saying? It's, we reject your lifestyle, we reject your culture, right? We reject your kind of bourgeois ways. We're going to have fun, we'll have free love, we'll smoke, we'll drink, that kind of thing. we'll have plays, we'll enjoy life, right? And that's the part that, like, in many ways is irritating is their politics. These people shouldn't be allowed to go out there and have fun, right? So there's a countercultural radical element to it. You challenge culture as well as challenging politics. So it really does say a lot about the kind of nature of the American political system at the time. All right. So if you haven't watched it, make sure you do, because it's good stuff. It's good stuff. I mean, when I do this class as a regular class, I have readings and I'll talk more about it. But sometimes you gotta kind of have to push things differently here because I don't have that much time, and that's why I want you to read this. All right. So you have this American Bolshevism. Now this frightens the ruling class a great deal because who is the inspiration for these people? It's what's happening in Russia. And what's happening in Russia? You have this Bolshevik revolution. So what? There's revolutions all the time. Nobody really liked the Tsar. Good to get rid of him, wasn't it? So what's wrong with the Bolsheviks? What are they changing in particular? I mean, what are they doing? They're eliminating private ownership, aren't they? So what happens to the banks? They're taking over. What happens to the factories? They're taking over, right? What happens to foreign investment? What about all these countries which have invested in Russia? What happens to them? They've lost their investments, right? What happens to the church and the media? It's shut down. The church in Russia, and it's the same thing the Wobblies would say. What was the role of the church in Russia? What's that? The problem of the Tsar. So what happens to the church? Steamroll, right? Steamroll, okay? So what happens to the economy? Who owns the farms and factories then? Technically the people does, but the state does, right? What happens to World War I? The Russians were fighting in World War I with the Bolsheviks. They got them out of the war, right? This is the West's worst nightmare. This isn't just like a change of government. This is the greatest challenge to capitalism in global history. It's the Bolsheviks. I mean, the Confederacy did it, the Populists did it. Nothing compares to what the Bolsheviks did. As soon as there are Americans who see that, who say, oh, look what the Bolsheviks did, we should try to adopt some of those ideas here. What happens then? What happens then to the level of repression? It goes to a whole new level. That's why you have like the arrest of judge, the Sedition Act. That's why you have the Pomeroys after World War I. Anybody heard of the Pomeroys and the Red Scare after World War I? After World War I, the government vehemently, with a vengeance, went after radicals. They deported 6,000 people without any hearing, much like we do today. 6,000 people were deported without any hearings or anything like that. A bunch of people were put in jail on really spurious reasons. Unions were crushed. Dissidents were crushed. This is when Debs goes to jail. A lot of people who were involved in this film, who were depicted in the film, were arrested. Emma Goldman was sent to Russia. One of the people not included in the film, who's very well known, was Margaret Sanger. Have you ever heard Margaret Sanger? What did Margaret Sanger do? Planned Parenthood. Sorry about that noise out there. Margaret Sanger was a very aggressive birth control advocate. She was a nurse. She had always been interested in the issue. One of her friends that had several children already asked her doctor for birth control. He refused to give it to her. She became pregnant again. The doctor refused an abortion. She tried to self-abort and died. And this made Sanger a real activist. She went around. She opened up birth control clinics. She was arrested several times, not for performing abortions or anything like that, for simply giving out information. You were not allowed, according to certain laws, they were actually obscenity laws. You could not provide information. If you sent birth control information, like a flyer, a pamphlet, you would be arrested based on these obscenity laws. Margaret Sanger's another one. She went to jail several times. This is a radical movement for women's rights. Now, the sad part of this, what was one of Sanger's biggest motivations for being a favor of birth control? She was a eugenicist. She believed in eugenics. You know what that is? What? Better babies. And what would, if you wanted to have better babies, who should not be having babies? What's that? Yeah, and in many minds in the early 20th century, including Margaret Sanger, she was that baby. Black, yeah. Sanger was really upset because the black birth rate was outrunning the white birth rate. So when there's a movement, and you see it this time too, there's a lot of places where they'll start sterilizing black women, that kind of thing. So there's actually this large, sadly, this eugenics component, which is, well, you gotta be careful of making a hero out of Margaret Sanger, yeah. What's that? He also defended Tennessee law, though. He did defend the Tennessee law.
Oh, no, he did, but it's because he thought that the Keeping Revolution would obviously not.
Well, I mean, in some cases, there was actually an active eugenics movement here in Texas. And those people, and I mean, it fits in perfectly, right? Because it's the racial politics today. But the people who advocate it tend to be progressive. So when you have a progressives who are pursuing this incredibly racist agenda, as bad as any Klansman, really, when you think about it. So it's very bizarre. And Sanger, unfortunately, I mean, one of the problems they have is, they're saying, like, all these black families are having a bunch of kids. All these immigrant families are having a bunch of kids, right? White people aren't having enough kids. So this actually motivates a lot of their advocacy of birth control. Oh, there's still people today talking about this, yeah. I mean, it's not that, one of the issues about immigrant, if you hear some of the more extreme people like in Arizona, that's one of the big issues. Well, anchor babies. What's anchor babies about, right? That's the whole idea. We're going to bring these people in who aren't really Americans, and they're going to make them Americans, and then pretty soon we're going to be overrun by these folks, right? So, no, it's clearly there's always been this, And I mean, that's one of the issues, like, you'll see, where we're not having enough white kids, that kind of thing. So this is part of that. I mean, Margaret Sanger really is striking a radical chord by saying women should control their own lives. They should be allowed to have kids when they want. They should be allowed to have abortions when they want. I mean, she was arrested and deported for setting up a birth control clinic and for passing out birth control information. And again, like I said with Debs, there are people who are throwing bombs and stuff like that, but these people, like in the movie Reg, what are they doing? What gets them in trouble? Why are they deported? Why are they arrested? For what? For their ideas. And this is the key thing I want to keep pushing. These people are getting in trouble for their ideas. The Green Corn Rebels, they got in trouble for their ideas, right? Now, in Haymarket, in Homestead and Pullman, and the Great Strike, yeah, there was violence there, absolutely. And we can discuss the question of who initiated it and all that stuff, but there was armed struggle in those cases. But in a lot of these cases, no. And as we increasingly go into the 20th century, that's going to be the dominant theme, and it's going to be so different than in other societies where there's not a legacy of violent rebellion or anything like that in the United States, all right? Let me stop there. I'm sorry, this has been a fairly disjointed class, all the technology problems and everything else. We'll see you tomorrow and talk through as much of this as we can. Keep up the video. What I want to do is get through as much as I can tomorrow. Next week, I want to go into the contemporary stuff, all right? I have 2 classes planned for next week. If I don't finish everything I want to do, I may have an optional one where you can come if you want, that kind of thing, all right? But I will keep looking at the Facebook page, and I'll send an email out to you. But I will have a question for you very, very soon. Sorry about all the techno problems.